They tell you when you join the infantry that the scariest sound in the world is silence after a firefight. You get used to the noise, the percussion of it, the way it fills your chest cavity and takes all the thinking out of you. Then it stops, and the silence rushes in like cold water, and you realize that whatever just happened is going to live inside you for the rest of your life, however long that turns out to be. I've been in 2 wars. I've heard that silence more times than I can count, but I never really understood what fear was until the morning the sky turned the color of a bruise over Cascade Falls, and something came down out of it that had no name in any language I spoke. My name is Jason. That's enough for now. Sergeant formerly, team leader currently, though there isn't much of a military structure to the outfit I'm running these days. 5 of us is all. 5 ordinary people who got pulled into something that should have been handled by someone with more rank, more training, more everything. It wasn't, so here we are. I want to tell this right. I owe it to the others to tell it right, so I'm going back to the beginning. Cascade Falls, Oregon. Population 42,000 before. A lot less after. Mid-sized city wedged between the mountains and the river. The kind of place where half the population works in timber logistics and the other half works in the coffee shops that serve the timber people. A gym on every corner, a church on every other one, high school football on Friday nights. I grew up there. Went to Cascade Falls High, played linebacker, got decent grades, enlisted the week after graduation because my father had and his father before him, and because I didn't know what else to do with the particular kind of energy I had back then, restless, purposeful, needing something to push against. To tour in the Pacific Theater. Came back 24 years old and felt 40. Got a job as a physical trainer at a civilian gym called the Vitality Center, the kind of place with exposed brick and overpriced protein shakes. Not what I'd imagined for myself, but it paid, and I was good at it. And mostly I just needed something to do with my hands while the rest of me figured out what came next. I met the others there or near there. Most of them I knew from high school, the way you know people in a town that size faces in the hallway, names attached to reputations. Zach had been 2 years behind me. Musician, comedian, the kind of person who walked into a room and immediately made it louder and warmer without trying. He worked at the gym part-time and spent the rest of his hours playing bass in a band that rehearsed in his mother's garage and had been about to break through for 3 years running. Kimberly I knew better. We'd been in the same social orbit senior year, before I shipped out. She'd been pre-med at Portland State, came back to Cascade Falls when her mother got sick, stayed longer than she'd planned. She worked at the hospital now, radiology desk, and you could see in her eyes the particular exhaustion of someone who had organized their whole life around a plan that fell apart and hadn't rebuilt it yet. Trini I barely knew before that week. She'd moved to Cascade Falls her junior year, quiet, kept mostly to herself, ran track and read physics textbooks in the bleachers while everyone else watched the meets. She was doing her master's at the community college annex, theoretical physics, and she ate lunch alone at the same table by the window every day and seemed to prefer it that way. Billy I knew by reputation more than anything else. 17, youngest of us, still in high school, a genuinely exceptional mind running at full speed in a body that hadn't quite grown into itself yet. He'd won the state science fair 2 years, running with projects that the judges admitted they didn't entirely understand. He also got beaten up with some regularity by a pair of upperclassmen who were exactly as stupid as their nicknames suggested, and he bore this with a resignation that was either very mature or very sad, probably both. None of us were soldiers. One of us had been. One. That's important because it meant I was the one who understood what was about to happen to us and couldn't stop it, and the others were the ones who went into it with no armor of expectation and maybe survived because of that. The week it started, I remember the weather going strange. That should have meant something to me, and it didn't. After 2 tour in active conflict zones, you develop a sensitivity to environmental wrongness, the particular stillness before an ambush, the change in air pressure before a mortar round arrives. I felt something in the air that Monday and Tuesday and put it down to an incoming storm front. Wednesday morning, I woke up at 4 a.m. for no reason I could identify, lay in the dark of my apartment, and listened to the silence, and the silence was wrong in a way I couldn't name. Thursday, the sky went purple. Not at sunset, not as a weather effect. At 11 in the morning, clear day, the sky over the eastern mountains went the color of a bad bruise, a deep rolling violet that spread across the horizon like something had been spilled on the atmosphere from the other side. I was on the gym floor when it happened. Every person in the building stopped what they were doing and stood at the windows. Nobody spoke for almost 30 seconds. Kimberly was there. She'd come in for a morning session before her hospital shift. She stood next to me at the glass and said, very quietly, "That's not a weather phenomenon." "No," I said, "it's not." The first impact came 17 minutes later. Not a strike, not an explosion in the conventional sense, more like a compression, a blunt, massive concussion that rattled every window in the city and set off every car alarm for 6 blocks. The sound that followed wasn't the sharp crack of a detonation. It was deeper. Older somehow, like something had displaced a vast amount of air with utter contempt for the physics involved. The broadcasts went fragmentary within the hour. Military had been scrambled. F-22s out of Portland Air National Guard, 2 Navy destroyers repositioning out of Puget Sound, National Guard units on standby in Salem. The official statement was that an unidentified atmospheric phenomenon was being investigated. The unofficial feeds were already running footage from the eastern hills, where something had come down and wasn't moving and wasn't a meteor and wasn't a satellite and wasn't anything anyone could explain with words they already had. What I saw in that footage, grainy, shot on a phone by someone who died 3 days later, was a structure. Not a ship in any sense I could map onto the word, more like a fortress or a court or something that had been designed to be permanent. Stone-colored but not stone, the surface moving in patterns that were almost biological, like slow respiration. Tall, very tall, and around it, swarming out of it, moving with a disciplined collective purpose that made my skin contract figures. They were bipedal, that was the first thing. Roughly humanoid geometry, 2 legs, 2 arms, upright posture, but everything else was wrong. The proportions were wrong, joints bending in ways that read as broken to the human eye, limbs too long, heads too wide, a flatness to the facial structure that suggested senses working on a different set of inputs than ours. And the surface of them, if you could call it skin, had the quality of compressed stone. Not armor, not a suit. Geological. As if something had grown over millions of years inside a gravity source much heavier than this planet and come out dense and hard and barely alive by any measure we'd recognize, and yet very much alive and very much purposeful. They moved in formation. That was the thing that hit me hardest, watching that footage on my phone while the gym emptied around me. They moved in formation with the automatic precision of units that had been drilling together for a very long time. No hesitation, no reconnaissance pause. They knew exactly where they were and they knew exactly what they'd come to do, and the doing of it had already started. The first military contact lasted 4 hours. I won't catalog the losses. The numbers were published eventually, after everything, and there in the record, and reading them now still makes me feel something I don't have a clean word for. The losses were sufficient to make clear that the conventional approach was not going to work. The stone-skinned things, we started calling them the patrol, the rank-and-file soldiers, because they moved and fought with that disciplined, subordinate purpose. They couldn't be stopped with small arms. Rifle rounds skipped off them. Crew-served weapons slowed them. Artillery neutralized clusters of them, but not enough and not fast enough. And behind the patrol came the command caste, the things that the patrol served, and the command caste had capabilities that didn't belong in any weapons manual ever written. She appeared on the 3rd day. I say she, because that was how it read, visually, though I'm aware that's a human projection onto something that probably had no use for the concept. The command caste's leader. She broadcast herself across every screen and surface that could carry a signal, and she stood in what looked like a throne room inside the fortress, and she looked at the camera with an expression that was not contempt exactly. Contempt implies that you consider the other party worth being contemptuous of. It was more like a naturalist might look at an infestation, a mild professional interest in the logistics of removal. She spoke. Whatever language she used, the translation came through somehow, not through any human system. The words simply arrived and they were not kind. You have been measured against our requirements and found insufficient. What remains of your leadership structures should stand down their defensive postures and begin population organization protocols. Resistance has been evaluated and its outcome is certain. We are not interested in the destruction of your infrastructure. We are interested in its use. Cooperate and many of you will continue. That was it. That was the entirety of what she had to say to a planet that had been building civilization for 10,000 years. I was watching it on my phone in the parking lot of the Vitality Center with Zach standing next to me, because nobody had gone home and nobody had gone to work and there wasn't anywhere to go. Zach watched the broadcast twice. Then he said, "She thinks this is already finished." "Yeah," I said. "She's been asleep for a while," he said. "You can tell. She's very confident about something she hasn't tested yet." I looked at him. That was a sharper observation than I'd expected, and it was exactly right, and it was the first indication I had that the people around me were not going to be as useless in what was coming as I'd feared. What came next, I still don't fully know how to explain, not because it was inexplicable, but because the pieces of it still feel too large to hold in sequence without some of them spilling. There was a man named Zorinder. Not a man, technically. I understand that now. But he presented as a voice and a presence, because by the time we met him, he'd been existing without a physical body for so long that the concept seemed to have become optional. He operated out of a facility built into the rock under the eastern ridge, a command installation that predated the current conflict by what he said was several thousand years, though he said it the way you might mention a commute time, matter of fact, slightly apologetic for the inconvenience. He'd been waiting. He'd been waiting for the imprisoned things in orbit, the Stonecast, the command entity, the whole sleeping apparatus of Conquest, to be released, because he'd known they'd be released eventually, because he'd spent a great deal of his existence tracking the probability. He reached out to us through the facility systems, which tapped into the civilian infrastructure so quietly and completely that we didn't notice until screens started showing us a different destination than the evacuation routes everyone was following. A frequency overlaid on the emergency broadcasts. His voice, calm and specific, saying 5 names. Only 5. And mine was one of them. I want to say I was skeptical. Professionally trained, combat veteran, not given to following unexplained voices through the wilderness during an alien invasion. But here is the thing about disaster that nobody tells you until you're in one. The calculation changes completely. In normal circumstances, you weigh risk against probability against the cost of being wrong. In a collapse, you weigh doing something against doing nothing, and doing nothing has a terminal outcome that makes the risk column almost irrelevant. I followed the signal. The others did too, for their own reasons, and none of us knew the others were coming until we all arrived in the same concrete and steel room 8 stories under a mountain, and stared at each other across a fluorescent-lit floor while a voice that came from everywhere and nowhere said, "Good. You're all here." Zorinder explained the situation with a clarity that I found simultaneously helpful and infuriating, because it was very clear that the situation was worse than even the news was reporting, and had been worse for a long time, and there had been people, or entities, who knew about it and had been preparing and had not told anyone. The Stonecast, he called them the Voakai, which seemed to be the closest phonetic approximation to what they called themselves, were not a military force in any sense we'd recognize. They were an institution. 10,000 years old at minimum, probably older. A civilization organized entirely around the acquisition and administration of other civilizations, with a bureaucratic thoroughness that would have been impressive if it hadn't been aimed at us. They'd done this before, many times. The Stoneskin was the product of their homeworld's brutal gravity and atmospheric conditions, and it made them effectively impervious to the weapons we'd fielded in the first 4 days of engagement. The command caste, the entity calling herself Repulsa, we'd gotten her name from the signal intercepts, was their high warlord, the centuries-old administrator of a conquest operation that she'd been running since before our Industrial Revolution. She'd been imprisoned by Zorander's predecessors, sealed in a containment vessel and placed in deep space, and 2 human survey workers doing a mapping run on what they thought was an uncatalogued asteroid body had opened the seal on Tuesday morning, 9 days ago, and that was why the sky had gone purple. She had approximately 10,000 Volkai soldiers on the surface within the containment vessel's operation range. She had the ability to reshape and grow her assault units using a process that Zorander described as biological, but I'd describe as more like manufacturing. She could produce specialized ground troops, enormous versions of standard Volkai warriors, tailored to specific tactical problems, in a matter of hours. She had the high ground in a literal sense, running her entire operation from a structure that was impossible to reach by any human platform we'd tried. She had been doing exactly this to other worlds for a very long time, and she was very good at it. What she didn't have was whatever Zorander had spent the last 10,000 years building in this room under the mountain. He called them regulators. The term doesn't translate well, but it's what I'm going with. 5 sets of equipment, physical interfaces, power systems, tactical overlays keyed to human biology in a way that the Volkai physiology couldn't interact with, because Zorander had designed them specifically to be operated by the kind of creatures the Volkai considered beneath notice. The power source he refused to explain in terms I could verify, and eventually I stopped asking because what I could verify was that it worked. Each set was color-coded, which felt almost insultingly simple until I understood that the color was a function of the frequency tuning, and the frequency tuning was what linked you to the specific power conduit that the system used, and the color was just the visible spectrum side effect. There was a logic to it even if it looked absurd. He gave us the option to decline. That's important. He was very clear that he was asking, not conscripting. He explained the odds honestly, and honestly the odds were not good. What he was proposing was that 5 ordinary people with no formal training in whatever this technology actually did should strap on equipment designed by an alien intellect and go stand in front of 10,000 stone-skinned soldiers and their centuries-old warlord commander and tell her no. And that if we did it right, if we could sustain the engagement, force her back into a defensive posture, disrupt her operational timeline enough to prevent the population organization she had planned, which nobody in that room had any illusions about, there was a possibility. Not a certainty, a possibility. Kimberly was the first to answer. She said, "What are the odds if we don't?" Zorander said very quietly that there were none. "Then it's not really a choice," she said. Trini said nothing. She walked to the equipment station bearing the yellow frequency marker and began reading the technical specifications on the interface panel with the focused, rapid attention of someone who had been waiting for a problem that big enough to be worth solving. Zach said, "I need to know one thing. Is there any version of this where we get to be loud about it? Because I have been indoors for 9 days and I am ready to make some noise." Billy said, and I remember this precisely. I will always remember it precisely. My father worked in the Cascade Falls Public Works for 31 years. This is his city. Nobody's organizing it into anything. That left me, the only professional, the only one who'd been trained to assess risk, to calculate margins, to know what a bad situation looked like and understand what it cost to go into one. The only one who genuinely understood what we were walking into. I picked up the red marker and I said, "All right, Somebody walk me through how this works. The first time we fielded the regulators, we nearly died inside of 4 minutes. And I want to be honest about that because there's a version of this story where 5 determined young people pick up alien hardware and immediately become unstoppable. And that version is a lie. The Volkai Patrol worked in units of 24. They were fast, not insanely fast, not faster than a human eye could track, but consistent in a way that human fighters almost never are. No fatigue variance. No hesitation variance. Every engagement was metronomic. They struck in coordinated patterns that shared tactical load across the unit, meaning that if you neutralized one flank you didn't weaken the unit, you redistributed. They'd been doing this for a very long time, and they were very good at it. The regulators gave us 3 things: physical enhancement, strength, speed, impact resistance at levels that put us past the soft tissue damage threshold that made hand-to-hand with the Volkai a death sentence for unaugmented humans. A directed energy capability, focused through handheld emitters that Zorander had paired with each system, which could destabilize the geological bonding in the Volkai hide given sustained application. Think of it as finding the frequency that made the stone want to come apart. And a communications relay that let the 5 of us coordinate in real time at a level of clarity that felt, the first time I used it, almost embarrassing, like suddenly being able to say exactly what I meant without losing anything in translation. What it didn't give us was experience. You can't shortcut that. You can't hardware it. Experience is the accretion of every decision that went wrong and the physical memory of what it cost and the adjustment you make because of it. And we didn't have any of that with this equipment on the first day. And the Volkai found the gaps in our coordination within seconds and put soldiers into them. Zach went down in the first engagement. Not killed. The regulator system's resilience protocols kept that from happening, but down hard, with 2 Volkai patrol units on him, and the emitter knocked out of his hand, and his left arm at an angle that looked bad and was. I pulled both units off him with my own emitter, and Kimberly dragged him clear, and Trini did something that I still, even now, think about when I'm trying to understand what happened to all of us over those 2 weeks. She didn't wait for coordination. She read the position, the vectors, the gaps, and she moved into them before I'd finished processing the tactical picture. Pure applied geometry. Pure physics. She'd spent 10 years studying the way objects moved in space, and it turned out that translated, without much modification, to the way enemies moved in a combat zone, and she was the best tactical thinker of the 5 of us from the first hour. We retreated that day. Zorander said nothing about it. He helped Zach with his arm, nothing broken, badly strained, and ran diagnostics on the regulator systems and said, "What did you learn?" What we learned was that we couldn't fight them the way the military had been trying to fight them. Mass, firepower, sustained contact, all of that favored the Volkai. What we could do that the Volkai couldn't was adapt in real time. They were metronomic. We could be irregular. They distributed tactical load with mathematical precision. We could be deliberately irrational in ways that the distribution algorithm couldn't account for. The second engagement went better. The third went better still. By the end of the first week, we had developed something that I hesitate to call a doctrine because it was too improvised and too specific to our particular 5. But it was a set of shared instincts, and that's the same thing with less paperwork. Zach's contribution I hadn't anticipated. His musicianship turned out to matter. The coordination problem with the Volkai was that they operated in perfect time, and once you understood their timing you could work with it or against it. The trouble was perceiving the timing accurately enough to use it. Zach could do this the way most people can't. He heard the rhythm of an engagement the way he heard music, and he could articulate what he was hearing to the rest of us in real time, which meant we had a tempo map that nobody else on the planet was working with. He kept calling out beats, literal beats, 1, 2, 3, 4 in the comms relay, and it sounds ridiculous and it worked extraordinarily well. Kimberly's contribution I should have anticipated and didn't, because I'd made assumptions about her based on a social category she'd mostly outgrown. She was precise. Not just accurate, precise in the engineering sense, a distinction that matters enormously when you're trying to apply sustained emitter contact to a specific target at range, while the target is moving through a formation, and you cannot afford the collateral dispersion. She could read angles off movement trajectories faster than anyone I've ever served with, and she had a patience under pressure that I'd describe as clinical, except that it was actually more warm than that. It was the patience of someone who genuinely cared about not wasting the shot. Billy, I want to say this carefully because Billy was 17 years old and had never been in a fight that he didn't lose, and I'm aware that there's something uncomfortable about what I'm describing. But he was extraordinary. He had looked at the regulator technology for 48 hours before we went into the first engagement, and he understood it better than any of us, including the aspects that Zorander himself had either forgotten or declined to explain. He started modifying. Small things at first, recalibration of the emitter frequency curves to better match the Volkai's specific geological bonding signature. And then larger things, changes to the interface protocols that improved coordination lag, changes to the resilience distribution that meant the regulator system could absorb more impact before shunting the excess to the user. Zorander watched him work with an expression that I can only describe as relieved, like something he'd been waiting for had finally arrived. And Trini, I've said some of it already, but I'll say this. In the second week when things got genuinely hard and the margins got small and we were all operating at the edge of what we could sustain, Trini was the one who kept the tactical picture clear. She didn't do it by being calm. She wasn't calm, none of us were calm. Calm is a luxury that genuine crisis doesn't permit. She did it by being relentless. She worked the problem, always the problem. When the rest of us were reacting, she was solving. And the gap between reacting and solving in a sustained engagement is the gap between getting through and not getting through. As for me, I trained them. Not formally, not with any structure, but in the hours between engagements, I put everything I knew about operating in bad conditions into terms they could use. How to manage fatigue without pretending you aren't tired. How to read a formation for its commitment indicators, where it's willing to hold and where it isn't. How to communicate under pressure with minimal signal. How to carry a casualty without compromising your own mobility. Small things, soldier things, the accumulated weight of decisions that went wrong and the lessons attached to them. I gave them everything I had. And what they gave back to me was something I hadn't had in 3 years of trying to figure out what came next. Purpose. The specific, heavy, unambiguous weight of it. You can't manufacture that. You either have it or you don't, and for a long time I didn't, and then I did again, and it made all the difference. The second week was harder than the first. Repulsa had evaluated our engagements. She was thorough, I'll give her that. She understood what the regulator systems implied, and she understood that 5 augmented humans were a different tactical problem than the conventional military approach she'd already solved. She adapted. She sent specialized units, the things we called the heavies. Volkai command warriors that had been reshaped for close contact assault. 3 meters of geological density, moving with terrible controlled speed. She sent them in groups of 3 with 6 patrol units as flanking screens, which meant you couldn't engage the heavies without first neutralizing the patrol, which meant your emitter cells were degraded by the time the heavies arrived. We lost ground in the second week. The city's eastern districts were deep in the Volkai operational zone. We fought, retreated, fought again. Kimberly took a strike from a heavy that cracked 2 ribs and put her out of a rotation. Trini got separated in the industrial district engagement, and we couldn't reach her for 6 hours, and the 6 hours felt very long. Billy's modifications kept the resilience protocols functional under conditions that Zorander quietly told me should have saturated the system and shut it down. And I made a mistake. I want to be clear about this. On the morning of the 11th day, I made a leadership mistake of the kind I'd been trained to avoid. I pushed the team into a position that the tactical picture didn't support because I was angry, because the anger had been building for 11 days, and because the Volkai had that day conducted what the after-engagement analysis confirmed was a deliberate psychological operation. They didn't need information from the civilian population they'd contained in the eastern zone. They wanted us to see what a corralling operation looked like. They wanted us to understand what population organization meant in practice. I pushed into a 3-heavy engagement with a flanking screen we hadn't fully mapped, and Zach and Billy both took heavy contact inside of 2 minutes, and Kimberly pulled me back, physically, by the arm, and said, in a voice that had the specific quality of someone who has run out of the patience to be diplomatic, "Jason, we're not doing this. Not today. Pull them back." I pulled them back. In the debrief that followed, nobody said anything about it. Not Kimberly, not any of the others. They let it lie where it had fallen, and in the silence I understood that the absence of critique was itself the instruction, that they'd registered it, and they trusted me to register it too, and that was enough. That kind of trust is not something you can earn in a classroom. You earn it by going into the bad places together and coming back. And we had done enough of that by day 11 that it existed, and knowing it existed was the thing that let me square my shoulders and get back to work. On day 12, Zorinder called us all together and said what he'd been building toward since the beginning. He had identified a limit. The Volkai Conquest protocol had a structural dependency that Repulsa had not changed in 10,000 years of operation, because she'd never needed to. The entire Volkai ground presence, all 10,000 patrol units, all heavy assault formations, all logistical and communication infrastructure, was administered through a central command relay housed in the fortress structure. Not unusual for a military operation. The unusual part was that the relay was not hardened against the regulator frequency range, because the regulator systems hadn't existed when the Volkai doctrine was codified, and Repulsa had spent 10,000 years locked in a containment vessel, and had not updated her threat assessment to include them. The relay could be disrupted at the source, by sustained emitter contact from inside the fortress. Inside the fortress meant past the entire Volkai ground presence, through the fortress perimeter, through the interior defensive architecture, into the central chamber where the relay was housed, and where Repulsa herself operated. 5 people all the way in. Zorinder laid it out flat and waited. He didn't editorialize. He didn't encourage. He'd spent 10,000 years understanding that there are decisions that can only be made by the people who have to live inside them, and he'd learned to step back from the edge of those decisions and let the people find their own footing. Zach was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "We've been in the fortress before, the east access during the day 10 engagement. We know the load factors on the interior patrol disposition." "Yes," Trini said. "And the heavy rotation on the perimeter runs on the same 4-hour cycle it's been running since day 3. She hasn't changed it." "She doesn't think she needs to," Kimberly said. "She's never needed to." Billy was already at a workstation. "If I reconfigure the emitter to a high dispersion pulse mode, single use, full cell discharge, the relay disruption radius would cover the entire chamber. We wouldn't have to hit the relay directly. We just have to get into the chamber." I looked at all of them. What I saw was what had been building for 12 days. Not fearlessness, none of them were fearless, and fearlessness is a liability in a soldier anyway, because fear is information. What I saw was decision. 4 people who had gone from ordinary to something harder, something more deliberate, in the way that a length of steel goes from ore to something useful when you put the right amount of heat and pressure on it for the right amount of time. They'd paid the heat and pressure. They'd done the time. "All right," I said, "walk me through the approach route." The morning of day 13 was cold. Ground fog off the river, the kind that gets into your joints and stays there. The sky over the city still had that bruised quality. We'd stopped noticing it, the same way you stop hearing traffic, but I noticed it that morning, standing at the ridge lookout while the others ran final system checks. I spent about 5 minutes just looking at it, thinking about what the sky had looked like before, the particular blue of the Cascade Falls autumn sky that I'd taken for granted for 24 years. I was going to get that sky back or I wasn't, and the outcome was going to be determined by what happened in the next several hours, and I'd made all the decisions I could make, and the rest of it was execution. Trini stood next to me at some point. She didn't say anything for a while. Then she said, "You know what I thought when Zorander first explained this?" "What?" "I thought this is a physics problem. Everything is a physics problem. Objects in motion, competing forces, the question of which force sustains and which one dissipates." She paused. "We're the force that sustains. That's not optimism. That's the analysis." I didn't answer, but I kept it. We went in at midday, when the Volkai perimeter rotated, and there was a 17-minute gap in the heavy coverage of the eastern approach. 17 minutes to get 5 people through the perimeter. We did it in 12. Zach's timing, Trini's geometry, Billy's modifications that had reduced our electromagnetic signature to a level the Volkai's detection systems weren't calibrated to register. And Kimberly's precision, which threaded every approach angle through the patrol formations without contact, a needle through a field of stone, no resistance at all. Inside the fortress was different from anything on the surface. The architecture had no human analogs, nothing designed for comfort or habitation in any sense I could map, only function. Corridors at angles that suggested the Volkai's joint structure moved differently than ours. Chambers calibrated for something other than human sensory comfort, too large, poorly lit by our standards, carrying a subsonic frequency in the floor that I felt in my back teeth the whole time we were inside. It smelled like mineral cold and something electric. The interior patrol was denser than outside. We fought for every meter of ground. Zach was calling beats in the comms relay, and I was directing traffic, and Trini was reading positions, and Kimberly was clearing angles, and Billy was keeping the emitters functional under conditions that were degrading the cell charge faster than projected. And it was loud and close, and the margins were very thin, and we kept moving. The command chamber was at the center of the structure, a room large enough to land a transport in, everything directed inward toward a raised platform, and the relay architecture built into the platform's infrastructure, a physical manifestation of the command signal, crystal and metal and something else, something that hummed at a frequency that made the regulator system's power indicators climb without input. The relay was real. The vulnerability was real. Repulsa was there. I'd only seen her on screens. In person, the scale of her was different. Larger than I'd expected, not physically large. She was perhaps 2 meters, not especially imposing, but large in the way that something very old and very confident is large, taking up more space than its dimensions account for. She was standing at the platform's edge as we came through the chamber entrance, and she looked at us with that expression I remembered from the broadcast, the naturalist expression, the mild professional interest. She said 5 humans, with consumer-grade hardware from a pre-contact repository. She paused. Zoranders, of course. "Stand down," I said. "Order your units to cease engagement. Return your forces to the vessel. This planet is not yours." She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said something that I've thought about a great deal since, because it was honest, and the honest things that your enemies say are the ones worth keeping. She said, "You have no idea how many times I've heard exactly those words, from species that built great empires, from civilizations that had been developing for hundreds of thousands of years, and I am still here and they are administered. What makes you believe you are different?" I said, "Because they hadn't figured out that you don't change." I don't know where that came from. It wasn't calculated. But the look on her face when I said it, the first fractional shift in that professional composure, told me it had landed where it needed to. She sent everything she had, every Volkai unit within the fortress converging on the chamber. What followed I remember in fragments rather than sequence. The way extreme situations encode, not as film but as photographs, a series of stills. Zack putting his body between a heavy and Billy and absorbing a strike that should have ended him and not ending. Kimberly's emitter running through its charge so fast that the housing was hot enough to see it in the dim light, finding every gap in the convergence and filling it. Trini working 3 patrol units simultaneously with an efficiency that I know, even now, I couldn't have matched. Billy on the platform with the reconfigured emitter, working against the relay architecture, the chamber lights beginning to pulse in a way that meant the discharge was building, and the relay was not going to survive it. I held the center. That's what I do. I held the center and I kept the chaos from reaching the platform, and I took damage and I kept moving. At some point I was aware that I was bleeding from somewhere, and I didn't stop to find out where. Repulsa came for me directly. She didn't send a subordinate. She came herself, with a close contact weapon designed for her physiology, and she was fast and experienced, and for approximately 30 seconds she was winning. I took a strike that put me on one knee on the chamber floor, and I looked up at her from that position and I thought, very clearly, this is the moment. This is what all the time and cost was for, and you can get up or you don't, and if you don't then everything behind you was for nothing. I got up. She made a technical error at that point, which I believe was the result of 10,000 years of never having been seriously challenged. She expected me to stop getting up. She'd miscalculated the recovery time after the strike, because she'd calibrated her expectation against the species she'd encountered before, and those species had apparently never had the particular combination of stubbornness and military training that produces a person who considers a strike that puts you on one knee to be an inconvenience rather than a conclusion. I got up and I came forward, and she had to step back to recalibrate, and in the half-second that cost her, I had my hands on her weapon arm and the leverage I needed. Behind me, Billy said, very quietly, clear. And then the world turned white. The pulse took approximately 4 seconds. 4 seconds of everything in the chamber running at a frequency that the Volkai relay could not absorb, every crystal in the architecture trying to hold a load it wasn't rated for and releasing it in the only direction available outward. The patrol units in the chamber stopped, not died. Stopped, the coordination signal severed. 10,000 individual soldiers suddenly operating without any tactical instruction from any source, standing in a ruined city with no orders and no direction and nothing to do. Repulsa was not dead. I want to be accurate about that. The pulse had disrupted her connection to the relay, but she was still Volkai, still the command caste, still old and hard and dangerous. She was also, for the first time in a very long time, alone. No army, no relay, no apparatus, just her in a room with 5 people who had spent 2 weeks figuring out how to fight people like her. She looked around the chamber. She looked at her stopped soldiers. She looked at the ruined relay architecture, and then she looked at me with something that was not the naturalist's expression anymore. I said, the vessel, you're going back into the vessel, permanently this time. Zorender handled the sealing. He'd been ready for it for 10,000 years, and he was thorough about it. The containment protocols were better than the previous ones. They accounted for the possibility that human beings might get their hands on it again someday, and they made that outcome considerably less catastrophic than the last time. The Volkai patrol unit stood in the streets of Cascade Falls for most of that afternoon, motionless, processing the absence of their coordination signal in whatever way their biology permitted. Some of them began moving back toward the vessel. Some of them stood until dark. Zorender said they would become a logistics problem eventually, the disconnected units in the field, but a manageable one. Something that trained soldiers with real resources could handle, now that the command structure was gone, and the adaptive threat had been neutralized. Managed, eventually. That was the word he used, and it was the first time in 2 weeks that the word eventually had referred to something other than our extinction. I'm writing this from the Vitality Center, which has been converted into a coordination hub for the recovery effort. The exposed brick is still there. The overpriced protein shakes are not. Kimberly is on the phone in the corner, talking to the hospital administration about what they need for the Eastern District clinics. Trini is at a table with a team of university physicists who flew in from Portland, and she's explaining something to them with the focused, rapid attention of someone who has had 2 weeks to work with technology that she's been waiting all her life to understand. Zach had a set last week. The first live music in Cascade falls in over a month, and I stood in the back of the venue and listened to him play, and it was very loud and it was very good, and I will never say that to his face. Billy is 17 and has already been contacted by 4 government agencies and 2 university research programs about the regulator technology, and his answer to all of them has been the same, which is that he'll talk to them when he decides he wants to and not before, and I find this more encouraging about the future than almost anything else I can think of. The sky is blue again, has been for 2 weeks. The specific Cascade falls autumn blue, the one I grew up under, the one I'd taken for granted for 24 years and had spent 2 weeks believing I might never see again. Zorinder asked me, in the final debrief, whether I understood why he had chosen the 5 of us specifically. Out of 42,000 people in this city, why us? I said I'd assumed it was something technical. The biological compatibility markers, the specific requirements of the regulator systems. He said that was part of it. Then he was quiet for a moment in the way that entities who have been alive for a very long time are sometimes quiet, a silence that contains more information than most people's words. And he said, "The Volcae have conquered civilizations of great power and sophistication. They have defeated armies of professional warriors. What they cannot defeat, what they have never encountered and cannot model, is an ordinary person who decides that ordinary is not sufficient and means it." I thought about what it meant to mean it, whether we'd meant it, whether the choice we'd made in that installation room under the mountain was the kind of meaning that earned the description. I looked around the Vitality Center, at Kimberly on the phone and Trini explaining physics, and the empty chair where Zach had been before he left for band practice. I thought about Billy's father, who had worked 31 years in public works, about the kind of unremarkable dedication that builds a city and keeps it running and never gets called heroism, because it doesn't look like heroism, it just looks like showing up. And how the line from that to what we'd done in the last 2 weeks was not as long as it appeared from the outside. We'd meant it, I believe that. We'd meant it the same way his father had meant 31 years of showing up, which is to say without drama, without calculation, with only the quiet refusal to let the thing you love become something other than itself. That's what we had that Repulsa couldn't account for, not our weapons, not our technology, not any particular tactical brilliance. The refusal, the specific human stubbornness that looks at an outcome described as certain and says, "Not yet." The sky outside the window is blue, the river is still running, the city is damaged but standing. Not yet is sometimes enough. There is something I haven't said yet, something I keep circling around in these notes because it doesn't fit neatly into the operational chronology, which is the framework my brain wants to use because it's the one I was trained in. But accuracy requires it, so here it is. There were days, specific hours inside those days when I wasn't sure we were going to make it, not tactically. I don't mean I ran the numbers and the numbers looked bad, though that was also true. I mean I lost, temporarily, the thing underneath the tactics that makes the tactics possible, the thing that tells you it matters whether you win. Day 8 was the worst of it. We'd run 2 engagements back to back because the Volcae had pressed the residential boundary while we were still resetting from the first contact, and we hadn't had time to rotate the emitter cells. And by the end of the second engagement, We were running on degraded equipment and depleted reserves, and we'd given ground on 3 blocks we'd held for 6 days. I got back to the installation and I sat down on the floor, not a chair, the floor, which tells you something about my state, and I looked at the ceiling of that concrete room and I thought, she's been doing this for 10,000 years. She was doing this to civilizations that had laser weapons and orbital platforms and whatever else, and she's still here and they're administered, and who exactly do we think we are? It's a specific kind of low, different from fear. Fear has momentum to it. Fear wants to do something, even if what it wants to do is run. This was a stillness, the stillness of a machine that has run down. Zach found me there. He didn't ask what was wrong. He sat down on the floor next to me, and for a while we didn't talk, which was not typical for Zach. Zach's default mode is filling silence, but he read the room correctly and he let it sit. Then he said, not looking at me, "You know what I do when a song isn't working?" I said I didn't. "I stop trying to fix it," he said. "I put it down. I go do something else. I eat something, or I sleep, or I watch something stupid on my phone for an hour. And then I come back to it, and usually it turns out the song wasn't broken. I was just in the wrong place to hear it correctly." I said this was a little different from a song not working. He said, "The principle's the same. You're tired. You've been making decisions for 8 days that nobody should have to make. So stop making them for a few hours. Eat something. Sleep. The song will still be here in the morning and you'll hear it right." I slept for 6 hours. When I woke up, the situation was objectively unchanged. Same alien invasion, same stone-skinned soldiers, same ancient warlord with the organizational framework and the contemptuous expression. But I could hear the problem again. The tactical music of it, the timing and the gaps and the places where the Voakai were consistent in ways that were also vulnerabilities. It was all still there. I just needed to be rested enough to listen. I've thought about that a lot, about the particular value of Zach, who was not a fighter in any conventional sense, and who brought to this operation a set of skills that had nothing to do with combat and everything to do with the parts of combat that nobody puts in the manual. Morale, rhythm, the specific human ability to take a terrible situation and find the beat inside it and keep moving. There's a version of those 2 weeks that emphasizes the hardware. The regulators, the emitters, the frequency tuning, Billy's modifications, all the technical infrastructure that Zorander had built. And that version isn't wrong. Without the equipment, we were 5 unarmed civilians in a city under occupation, and that story ends very differently. The hardware mattered. But hardware doesn't get up off a concrete floor at 4 in the morning and go back to the problem. Hardware doesn't decide that the city it grew up in is worth the cost. Hardware doesn't sit down next to someone who's run out of fuel and say, "Rest. The song will still be here in the morning," in a voice calm enough to actually be believed. That's the part of the story that doesn't translate into an operational summary. The part that lives in the spaces between the engagements, in the debrief silences, in the 6 hours when Trini was separated, and the 4 of us ran through every available signal frequency trying to reach her and didn't say to each other what we were thinking, which was that she might not be findable, which was that the math might not work this time. We didn't say it. We kept transmitting. 47 frequency sweeps across 6 hours, and on the 48th one her voice came back through the relay, flat and precise, and a little annoyed. "I'm in the warehouse district, Sector 12. I have 2 patrol units at distance, and I need an extraction route." And the sound of it hit me somewhere behind my sternum in a way that I would not have predicted before that week, and still don't have an adequate word for. That's what we were, the 5 of us. Not a unit in the military sense. Something less structured than that and more durable. The specific thing that forms when ordinary people go through extreme conditions together and come out the other side changed in ways they didn't choose and wouldn't have chosen and wouldn't trade now. I spoke to Zorander last week. He's still operating out of the installation under the ridge, running what he describes as long-term threat assessment, and what I describe as worrying, which seems to be his primary mode of engagement with the universe. He's tracking the Volkai disconnected units, the soldiers standing motionless in various corners of the eastern districts, and coordinating with the military organizations that are now properly engaged with the cleanup problem. He said the disconnected units showed no aggression without the relay signal driving them. They were confused, maybe. Purposeless, possibly. Whatever the Volkai equivalent of lost was, they appeared to be experiencing it. I asked him if he felt any sympathy for them. He thought about it. He said, they were soldiers. Soldiers follow orders. The orders came from Repulsa, and Repulsa is sealed, and there are no more orders. I don't know that sympathy is the right response, but I don't have contempt for them either. They were instruments of something that chose to be what it was. They were not themselves what made it evil. I thought about that for a long time afterward, about the way large harmful things are constructed from small components that might, individually, be capable of something other than harm, about whether that diminishes the harm or just explains it. I don't have an answer. I'm a physical trainer from Cascade Falls who spent 2 weeks wearing alien hardware and fighting a 10,000-year-old conqueror. I'm not equipped to solve the deeper philosophical problems. I just know what I did, and why I did it, and what it cost. The cost is real. I want to be clear about that too, because the story can sound, in the telling, like something that worked out cleanly, a problem solved with the right tools and the right people and a satisfying resolution. It didn't feel like that from inside it. Kimberly's ribs are going to bother her for another few months, maybe permanently in cold weather. Zach still wakes up at 3 in the morning sometimes and can't get back to sleep, which his bandmates know about because he texts them at 3 in the morning, which is an imposition he refuses to acknowledge. Trini has thrown herself into the theoretical work around the regulator technology with an intensity that I think is partly genuine passion, and partly the way some people deal with the aftermath of things they haven't finished processing. Billy is 17, and will have to find a way to be 17 in a world that now knows what he's capable of, which is a specific and difficult thing to navigate, and I try to check in with him when I can. And me, I still wake up at 4 in the morning sometimes and lie in the dark and listen to the silence. The silence is better now. It doesn't have that wrong quality anymore, the off-note pressure that preceded everything. But it still wakes me and I still lie there. And in those moments I run through it in sequence. The sky going purple, the parking lot broadcast, Zorander's voice over the emergency frequency, the concrete floor of the installation, all of it like a soldier reviewing a mission that's over but not quite finished living in them yet. They tell you that's normal. They tell you it recedes. I believe them. I've been there before and it did recede eventually, and eventually is a word that now carries different weight for me than it used to. The work continues. That's the other thing they don't tell you about being the people who held the line. The holding of the line is not the end of the obligation. It's the beginning of a different one. You can't put the regulators down and walk back to your previous life because your previous life was continuous with a city that needs rebuilding, and you are part of the city, and you don't get to not be. Kimberly is working with the hospital on the Eastern District Clinic Network. Trini is working with Zorander on the technology documentation, making sure that whatever the regulators are, and whatever they can do is understood and recorded by human beings, which seems important to both of them. Zach's band has been playing benefit shows for the Eastern District Rebuild Fund, and somehow this has also resulted in them getting signed to a real label, which Zach treats with a studied nonchalance that convinces no one. Billy is still in high school, technically, though the school has made certain accommodations regarding his schedule. His father still works in public works. The city is being rebuilt in part by the same hands that built it the first time. I'm still at the Vitality Center, still training people. The exposed brick is still there, and one day the protein shakes will probably come back. In the meantime, I open the gym at 6 in the morning and I watch people work, and I think about what it costs a person to do a hard thing and keep doing it when the results aren't immediate, when the progress is small, when the weight doesn't move today but might move tomorrow. That's what training is. That's what it has always been. Not yet is sometimes enough. But sometimes, if you keep showing up, not yet becomes something else. Becomes a morning when the weight finally moves and you weren't expecting it to, and there it is. And you rack it and you catch your breath and you think, all right, what's next?